all the members and all the executive members are here tonight, and all the officers, to our second virtual meeting of the Trafford Pandemic Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And can I just remind everyone, this meeting is being broadcast live and will be available after the meeting via the Council's YouTube channel. And can members and officers please remember, use the raise hand feature, which is on the bar, and can you mute your microphone when you're not speaking? And if you're struggling with your internet connection, I believe turning your camera off may help just for a while. And it's nothing to do with your faces, by the way. Right, well, we have two main items tonight on the agenda that members are very interested in. Executive members and officers have been asked to provide a verbal update, and committee members were asked to provide questions in advance in order to help to frame the response to the committee. However, there is a large number of questions that have been received. Some are quite technical in their nature, which, given the time available at tonight's meeting and the demands on the service in responding to the pandemic, meant it may not be possible to cover everything in detail. Officers will cover as much as they reasonably can do in the time available, and where appropriate, a more detailed response can be given outside of the meeting if that is required. And I think, you know, for the smooth running of the meeting, we hope that we can get through all of the items and the questions that have been asked. So with that kind of introduction, the first item on the agenda is attendance, and this is to note the attendance, including officers, and any apologies for absence. We have received one apology, and that's from Councillor Shaw. Are there any other apologies?
No other apologies have been received, Chair.
Thank you. Item 2 are the minutes, and it's the minutes of the last meeting on the 27th of May. Can we agree to note those minutes? Everybody happy? Yep.
A second.
Sorry. I'll take that as read.
Sorry, David.
Yes.
I couldn't find the raise hand icon quick enough. I do apologise. I think my name is actually missing from those present at the last meeting. So with that requested change, please.
Yeah, that's fine, John. Make sure that that happens. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Does anybody wish to declare any interest for the items on the agenda? No? Item 4 is urgent business, and I haven't received any. So item 5 is questions from the public, and again, I haven't received any questions from the public. Item 6 is the post and pre-decision scrutiny. And you've all seen what decisions have been made by the executive. These items are for noting, and if any committee member wished to receive additional information on any of these items, they could ask at the meeting or either receive answers via email, or it could be considered at a future as a future agenda item. So has anybody got anything to raise in relation to item 6? I'm not seeing anybody. So again, these are just for noting. So thank you for that. So we go into the meat really of the agenda, and the first of those is item 7, health and social care. And I suggest in terms of timings, but for this and the next item 8, we'll time around about 50 minutes, up to 50 minutes actually. So if we can do it a little bit sooner, that will be beneficial for us to sort of at the end have, you know, 10, 15, 20 minutes to discuss some of the things that we've heard within the meeting. There will be, obviously, you'll have some questions relating to some of the answers that we get to the questions that we've asked. You know, I'll try and move it quite quickly, or as quickly as we can. Some of the issues are very complex. Yeah, if there's any additional information that could be asked at the meeting, and either receive answers by email as well. Oh no, that was the other one, wasn't it? Sorry. Yeah, so if we go on to health and social care, and I think for health and care in attendance we have Councillor Slater, the Executive Member for Health and Wellbeing and Equalities, and Eleanor Rolfe, Director of Public Health. So I don't know who's going to speak first. Councillor Slater, is it you? Or?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Dave. We've received some quite in-depth questions, and Eleanor has been pulling together some written answers for us that we'll be able to sit along the minutes once they have been from this meeting, once they've been agreed and finalised. But if there's anything within there, because there are quite a few topics, if there's anything in there that people would like us to give answers on this evening, we're more than happy to do that. Obviously, I know that there are some really keen priorities around mental health, obviously the impact of COVID on the BAME community, and I think that people may be keen to understand what track, trace and test, or trace and track and test, I get those three mixed up quite often, what that will look like in Trafford going forward. So if there are any specifics that the committee would like to ask us, we're more than happy to respond to any questions this evening. But like I said, Eleanor has been working with other officers across GMHH around mental health, and with some partners in Greater Manchester to get some answers together for us. So if you, like I said, if you've got any questions that are specific that we can sort of deal with tonight, I'm more than happy to.
Well, I think, I'll just bring in terms of the questions that we've asked, I think some actually relate to the public health, and some relate to the social care, and we do have Councillor Harding, and you know, the executive member for adult services, and Diane Eaton, who is the corporate director of adult services. And I think you know, we've kind of lumped those two together, but the questions that we asked was around mental health, and the CQC report regarding learning difficulties and autistic spectrum disorder, and amendments to the Care Act. And I think what members are also interested in is the test, track and isolate. So they were the points that we wanted to really bring out in tonight's meeting. So I don't know who wants to kick off in relation to those.
Well, I think a lot of the mental health questions tie into the answers that Diane Eaton will be giving, and similarly with the learning disabilities. So if I run through some of the issues regarding the BAME population and also the test, track and trace, and then if Diane leads on the mental health and learning disabilities, would that?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Yeah.
If I start with the questions we were asked, and then if people have other questions, I'm happy to either answer them or take them back. So we got asked about the disparities in the risk and outcomes for COVID-19 among our BAME population, and whether the situation in Greater Manchester is the same as the national situation, where we've seen far more deaths in people from black and from Bangladeshi and Pakistani origins than from the white population. So across Greater Manchester, it's quite difficult to get a clear idea because death certificates don't record ethnicity. So we're having to do some work to look back to see if we can match the data that we have on the deaths with other pieces of information to make sure whether that has happened. What we've done as an interim is that we, Greater Manchester have done a piece of work on inequalities in COVID, because it's not just ethnicity inequalities, but also deprivation is a big risk factor for death from COVID-19, as is underlying health conditions, particularly diabetes and high blood pressure. So what we've done is there's a Greater Manchester paper has been done, and it is clear that the picture seems to be similar in Greater Manchester as the national picture. And we have also been looking at the deaths in Trafford, and because we don't have the full details yet on ethnicity, what we've done is map the deaths that we've got against the population profiles by ward of different ethnicities. And I would have to say we've got no reason not to think that the picture in Trafford is the same as the national picture. Highly likely that the national picture is also being played out in Trafford. So the second question was what extra steps are being taken to protect these vulnerable groups. So what we've been doing is trying to make sure that the services we provide, and particularly the access to testing and treatment, are being properly followed through, because one of the other things that you'll be aware of is that we've seen an excess deaths of people from COVID-19, but also from people from other conditions, possibly because people aren't accessing health services in a timely manner. So we're wanting to make sure that we look at all the deaths rather than just the COVID-19 deaths. And we've been looking at the testing and the access to testing in Trafford, and working as part of the Greater Manchester strategy for increasing the amount of people tested. We've been also working with some of the community groups in how the messaging about testing is given to people and what support people need in order to access testing and to allay people's fears about the test. And finally, our community hubs have been hugely powerful and very, very effective in reaching our population, different populations across Trafford. And we'll be looking at how that goes forwards and how we make sure that our community hubs are accessible to all of our populations and that they're providing the support that people need in a timely manner. And also are being designed with, what's been fantastic with the community hubs is that co-design element with our communities to make sure that those communities are really key to making sure that the services that are being provided are designed and delivered in a way that suits those communities.
Thanks for that. Does anybody have any questions on the BAME from what Eleanor has said? Any follow-up questions? No? Okay, we move on to which one do you want to move on to now, Eleanor? Is it the track and trace or the mental health?
I'll stick with the public health bits
Right.
of test, track and trace, if that's okay. And then if there are public health elements of the mental health, I'll come in after Diane, if that's okay.
No,
So
that is fine, yeah.
On the test, track and trace, we got asked what progress has been made with the test, track and trace and isolate system. What's Trafford's involvement? So nationally, you will know that the national system went live on the 28th of May. And the national system is expecting to deal with about 80% of contacts of confirmed cases. So about 80% of the confirmed cases will be dealt with through a national system of web-based system and telephone calls from that national team. And then about 20% of the cases will get escalated to Greater Manchester in our case. And those cases are cases where there are more complexities about the case. So it might be about the individual characteristics with the case. So it might be a population, for example, of people that like rough sleepers who may not have access to web-based systems for contact tracing, or where people might not be so keen to engage with telephone-based systems. or it might be where there's other risks around the setting, so a high consequence setting or a high risk setting, and we'd include schools or care homes in those settings where we really do want to be able to understand what the implications for that setting is. So those systems come through to the Greater Manchester team, and the Greater Manchester, that went live last Monday. It's still, I would say there's still teething problems, as you'd expect, both in the communication from the data that comes from the central system into Greater Manchester is still being developed and still needs tightening up. So there have been some difficulties there. But the idea that the other issue we have is obviously locally, we often hear about a test before the confirmed positive comes through. So we'll often hear about suspected cases in a care home or in a school before the testing's done. So we hear quite often before the national or the local, the GM system knows anything about it. So quite often we've already started pieces of work with those settings to make sure that we've got everything in place in case somebody comes back positive. So it's early days, but I'm really positive about it. I think it will work. I think it will be. We do need to make sure that we get those test results through as quickly as possible. But we're getting a lot more input, I would say, as a locality into the design of the systems than we had previously. So early days, but it's on its way. And the next.
Do we have any idea? Do we have any idea, Eleanor? How many have been tracked and traced in Trafford and then in Greater Manchester?
So in Greater Manchester, I'm not sure, but in Trafford we have had, I think it's about, certainly on Friday, and I should have looked immediately, I can go and look now, but we've had over 100 since the national system went live, which was at the end of May. And 25 of those have been escalated up to Greater Manchester, but most of those were either healthcare workers or people in care homes. Those have been the two biggest groups of people that have been escalated up to us. And then we've got some ongoing work with care homes and schools that we're waiting for results from.
Okay, Karen. Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Eleanor, for that feedback on the test, track and isolate. I've just got a couple of questions, really. First of all, how long is it now taking for test results to be returned? Because obviously this is really crucial, isn't it, in terms of that whole system operating efficiently and effectively. And also, of the people that you've been asked to contact, what percentage of people have been isolated as a result of the kind of contact tracing? And are we actually monitoring? Because obviously it's one thing saying to somebody over the phone, yes, I'll isolate, but what are we doing in terms of trying to make sure that that happens? And are we giving people who are isolating any support? Because it's another thing to say, you will isolate, but then what happens if you need, financial support or shopping or things like that? So, and also, could I just have kind of an impression of how effective you think the system is operating at the moment? I mean, you said that you think it's got a way to improve. I think we were being told it was going to be world standard. I mean, just how far away from it is it at the moment? Thank you.
So we are still away from a world standard, I have to say. How long is the test taking? The test, we've got two different routes for testing. We've got a local route, which is called Pillar 1, which goes via the MFT labs, the labs at the Manchester Foundation Trust. Those we're getting back very quickly, within 24 hours. That part of it I'm not at all worried about. That's most of the people through those routes are care homes, care home residents, and healthcare workers, and some other groups, so particularly high risk groups. So they will be the ones where we've sent out our community swabbing team, and we get those results back within 24 hours, and we're all quite comfortable with the responsiveness of that. The national system isn't working as smoothly yet, and it does still seem to be, I think it is improving. We've, on Friday, for the first time, and I was very excited about this, which is slightly sad, we actually got the Pillar 2 data from the national system. That was the first time I had actually had any data on the number of tests going through the Pillar 2 route for Trafford. in all of the time that the Pillar 2 route's been running, which was since May. So middle of May. So we are now getting that data through. In terms of the responsiveness, at the moment, I get data on how many people have been contact traced, but not the results of that, and not whether people are self-isolating as a result of that. So I don't get the data at the moment at that level of granularity. I don't know if Greater Manchester is getting that yet, but as I said, the Greater Manchester system only went live on Monday, so they really haven't, they're only just starting doing any, so we will be reliant on the national data, which, so I imagine the data that we get for Trafford is what you will have heard at the press over the weekend, and that level of compliance. I am hoping that once we get to the, particularly with the healthcare workers and with our local high consequence settings, I think we will get better rates of self-isolation because we're doing so much work with those settings. So with our schools and with our care homes, we're really engaging with them about why they need to why their workers need to self-isolate and so on. So I'm much more confident that with a lot of those settings, we are getting very good compliance. So I think, you know, it is, but it's early days and we are trying to make sure that all of that is monitored. In terms of the support to people when they're self-isolating, I think that's going to be an increasing issue, and it's one that needs to be brought up nationally and regionally, because at the moment, while people are furloughed or while people are able to, you know, there's people are working from home, it's not so difficult for people to self-isolate, but as the economy starts going again and as businesses start to set up again, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult, particularly for our low paid residents, to be able to engage effectively with that. And again, one of the things we will be looking at is the uptake of testing around the borough by geography and by communities, so that we can try and do some work. If we think that some populations, subpopulations aren't accessing testing, it will be a question of trying to do some work with those populations to try and think about how they can be encouraged to go for testing if they're symptomatic and what support they need. Again, this comes back to the conversations about the community hubs as well, but it's a very big problem for us, and especially as this could be going on for 18 months. And it won't be, you know, it's when everybody is self-isolating, if you like, it's one thing, but if it's just your household, it becomes a very different matter. So it's really important that we have really good plans in place and that our communities are engaged in the designing of those plans, because you have to be prepared to do this. It's going to be a long slog for all of us, I think. And you can't do this to people, you have to do this with people.
Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Eleanor. So in terms of the data that we collect through the track and trace arrangements, is it sensitive enough to draw or look for correlations between you know, the tracking and the tracing and phases of the you know, the unlocking or the lifting of the lockdown? So those various phases, as our schools, for example, who some went back last week, secondary schools today. You know, in terms of the detail and information that's collected, is that kind of correlation possible?
I'm really hoping it will be. It hasn't been possible up to now because I've just been getting data for, well, I've been getting Trafford data for the Pillar 1. I've been getting Trafford data for Trafford, and for Pillar 2 until Friday, I hadn't been getting anything. But it will be able to be broken down at a more locality level, so we'll be neighbourhood level, so we'll be able to start following some of that up. We will also, I've also asked to make sure that we can get information about the setting, that the occupation or you know, whether it's linked to a business or whether it's a care home or a school or so that we can follow that up. What we're hoping is to be able to pick up by doing a really thorough testing program, that we'll be able to pick up cases early rather than the previous systems, which was really waiting for people to be ill enough, or enough people to be ill enough that they were getting hospitalized, which obviously is about a week or two after the infection. So we're really trying to get this data, as Councillor Barclay says, getting the test result quickly and getting it on that geographical basis, we'll be able to use that to really understand what's going on in our population. And we're still waiting for that data, but we have been promised it.
Councillor Barker, then Councillor Coggins. Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, just another quick one. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for explaining that. Could I just ask, given that GPs may be aware of infections perhaps before other kind of like the national system is informed, I mean, are we trying to draw GPs into the process and using their local knowledge and expertise as well?
We are, but a lot of people have been encouraged not to go to their GP for COVID-related matters, because obviously we don't want the spread infection through there. But what we can do now, and we, again, as of Friday, I've started getting data from the 111 system of how many calls are being made to 111. So that will give us a really good idea of what's going on in our area, because actually most people, when particularly to book a test, are doing that through the 111 system. And the fact that people ring up and ask about tests as well gives you an idea of what's going on in the community, if people are starting to have anxieties and therefore booking or inquiring. So we're using that system. We will now be able to use that system as well.
Okay, Councillor Coggins.
Thanks, and thanks, Eleanor, for the update, and I can see the vast amount of work that has gone into this across all of GM. I'm just wondering, on a bigger picture level, if we're learning from elsewhere. So it sounds like GM is doing well here, but there's places like South Korea that have been doing this for months. Are there conversations going on at some level, presumably not Trafford level, but somewhere along the way, saying, look, these people were the early adapters, we can learn from their mistakes, we can copy the best bits and get something up and running really quickly?
So, and I think one of the, I mean, that's been going on all the way through. And I think one of the big learning things from this is that a lot of Asian countries had experience from MERS, well, and particularly from SARS. And so the population was much more alert to all of this. SARS obviously had a much higher death rate and was a more serious illness than COVID-19, but it was also easier to contain because it was more serious. So you didn't have the number of asymptomatic people and that route of transmission. And also you didn't have as much pre-symptomatic transmission. So I think the populations in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they were already much more alert to what you have to do, and nationally the governments were also much more aware of what you need to do in these situations. I think in Europe we've had such a long time without needing to do anything like this, that we have actually been caught on the hop, us, Italy, Spain, France particularly. So there's all sorts of reasons behind that, but we are definitely behind as the death rates show.
Okay, I can't see any other hands. Councillor Slater, did you want to just come in on this?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think the point that Councillor Coggins was making around learning lessons from other countries around the world, I think, you know, hopefully we are doing that. My son lives in Taiwan and they've still only had 7 deaths since the onset of COVID. Where he lives, they're only actually 88 miles away from Wuhan. I know there's water in between, but it's not, you know, it's not very far. And in Taiwan, they have a population the same size as Australia. So, you know, the tracking and tracing, which we started to do initially at the very beginning of this pandemic. I think that, you know, we tracked and traced a couple of people who'd been to northern Italy skiing, and, you know, those people were isolated quite early doors in Trafford. But then, you know, there was a decision to stop doing tracking and tracing. But tracking and tracing has stopped lockdown in a lot of countries. So, you know, this needs to be the way forward for us. So I think the work that Eleanor's doing and some of the information that we will have for you on another meeting going forward, I think, you know, you'll see that actually tracking and tracing does work. So pretty much, yeah, that was all I needed to say, Dave. But thanks anyway.
That's absolutely fine.
I think the other things I would just add for the benefit of scrutiny, the track and trace will work, but it only works if you've got enough insufficient numbers of cases in the population to make tracking and tracing worthwhile, if you follow me. If you get too many cases, you're back down to lockdown. And the way that we can stop it spreading is by really maintaining the good respiratory hygiene, the good hand hygiene, and absolutely that physical distancing, and making sure that we stay those 2 meters away from people. And I think especially for businesses coming back, we really need to be supporting our businesses to understand the importance of their workers keeping that distance from each other and being able to do that, because without that, you could quite easily get a whole business suddenly discovering that, you know, somebody is a case and your whole business is closed for 14 days because other people were contacts and needing to self-isolate. So it is really important that at the moment we don't think track and trace will do this on our own. We have to be taking absolute ownership of our responsibility for our lives and making sure that we don't inadvertently spread the disease or put ourselves in danger of catching it. So again, it's those same messages about the 2 meters, don't see too many people, stay outdoors wherever you can, much less spread outdoors, and make sure you wash your hands.
Thanks. Councillor Barker, you wanted to just come back in briefly.
Thank you very much. Just a real quick question for Eleanor. Thank you again. Eleanor, could you just say, or let us know, how many people are actually within the council tracking and tracing? What size is the team? And does the team feel overwhelmed right now? Are there too many cases to do all the tracking and tracing you need to do, or do you feel there's just about the right balance? Thank you.
So the way it's being organised in Greater Manchester is that the tracking and tracing team, most of the contact tracing is being done by the Public Health England and the Greater Manchester team. And then we get involved in the local hard cases, and we will be so what we're doing at the moment is my colleagues Helen Gollins and Donna Sager, who I think members of the committee will know. Donna is leading on testing and Helen on contact tracing, and we're just setting up the programme at the moment for how we're going to make sure that if we do get cases in high consequence settings or settings where we need to actually send somebody out, so that might be with, say, our drugs and alcohol service users or traveller communities, who will do the contact tracing in those cases. And so we're looking at, for example, with our traveller communities, we know our health visitors have really good relationships with those communities. So we'll probably be talking to the health visitors about how they do the contact tracing in that situation. Similarly, our drugs and alcohol service workers, etc. So in terms of us locally, what we're doing locally is setting up the program management of all of that, the training, the tech, etc., linking in with the Greater Manchester system. There's been some national funding to support this, and we have put forward a plan of the number of people that we think need to work in Trafford to help support the programme. That will include, for example, communications support. This won't all be public health people, not only because it needs to be spread across the council because of all the different skills and all the different parts of the council that this will affect, but also if you imagine trying to split that, you know, most public health people in the country are already employed doing, you know, all my retired colleagues are all back working at Public Health England. So we are going to be spreading this around the different parts of the council. So, but we are getting funding into the council to help us support us with that.
Okay, thanks very much, Eleanor, for that. I've got no other questions on that. If we go back to the mental health, and you know, I think you were sort of saying that this comes under Diane Eaton and Joanne Harding.
Well, certainly, just to say on the mental health, it's the question. A lot of the questions are quite specifically about the services, but one of our concerns, obviously, from a public health perspective, is the impact that COVID-19 is having on our population, especially the impact of isolation on our children and young people and their education prospects, but also the impact of social isolation on teenagers being particularly negative. So trying to make sure that we have been working hard to try and make sure that our young people are properly supported.
Yeah. Okay, so Thanks very much, Eleanor. It's been very helpful. Can we just move on then to social care? And I don't know how you want to take this, Joanne and Diane. Should we start on the mental health? And then there are the CQC's report regarding learning difficulties and autistic spectrum disorder, and amendments to the Care Act. Yeah, I think those are the main ones. Yeah. So I don't know who wants to start. Councillor Harding or?
Yeah, I'm very happy to start, Chair. Do you want me to start with the easements to the Care Act? If we do that
It's up to you, really. Yeah, as long as you tell us which ones you're going into.
I'm going to start with the easements to the Care Act first of all, and obviously I'll bring Diane in potentially on some areas if there are any gaps that have left, really. So. Yeah. So you'd all be aware that adult social care works under the framework of the Care Act, and there were some easements made to the Care Act from the 31st of March in order to be able to respond to the COVID pandemic. I think some of the things to say really about why the easements came into force really was about allowing councils to manage the pressures that they found themselves under as a result the impact on social care, and to be able to prioritise how we resource and target our interventions around social care. I think the thing to say at the very beginning, and I know that the word unprecedented is used a lot, but I want to stress just clearly how difficult these times have been for staff working in health and social care. So I think that needs recognising right from the very beginning, and the impact that this pandemic has had on all services across health and social care, really. So those easements came into effect from the 31st of March. And what we have seen actually is a really true integration between health and social care as a result of us really pulling and working together over the last 10 to 12 weeks, really. Some of the changes that have been brought into force means that councils will not have the duty like they used to have in the past to assess, to do very detailed assessments. They won't be having to do financial assessments, and some of the responsibilities to carers, it's a duty to provide as opposed to some of the powers, really. A power to me as opposed to duty. So what that has allowed us to do with some of the easements though, and just to say that Trafford has not moved from stage one of those easements. So really for us, in many ways, it is business as usual. But one of the things that has happened as a result of the easements is that you will know that Trafford has historically been an outlier in relation to our delayed transfers of care, with people being in hospital when they haven't needed to be at times because we haven't been able to get people out to the right kind of placements. One of the things that Trafford has put in place is the provision of discharge to assess capacity. So that has meant that we've had beds for people to go to where they've been able to be discharged from hospital safely to another setting, which has allowed us to carry out a more detailed assessment of needs until we can consider what the next destination will be for that person, bearing in mind that the person should always have a degree of choice in where they want and are able to go. So whether that means we discharge somebody safely to home with a package of care, or whether they eventually are discharged to a care or nursing home. But that discharge to assess facility has enabled us to move people very quickly out of hospitals. And that's absolutely been the right thing, because it's allowed us to have capacity of hospital beds, which we've needed those beds in case we did see, increased admissions of people with COVID. So the other thing just to say is that it is time limited, and there is a process of checks and balances for the Easement of Care Act. So what that means is we haven't moved, we haven't had to progress, and we haven't had to change a lot. But one of the things that would become an issue would be, for example, around staffing. if we didn't have the staffing as a resource to be able to carry out some of our business as usual, then we might need to change and move to the next step of easements. But at any step where there are changes needed, so Diane as the Director of Adult Social Services and Emma Brown as the Principal Social Worker would need to involve me as the Executive Member for Social Care about any changes that are made. As changes progress, then things like that, the Health and Wellbeing Board would be involved, the MP would be involved. So there are checks and balances when decisions have to be made as if we needed to progress throughout the easements. So I just wanted to give you some assurances that there are checks and balances if we needed to do that, really. So I hope that answers some of your questions around the easements.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. All the members of the committee had the reports from the last Wellbeing Board meeting and the video that was in there, and obviously this topic was brought up at that meeting, and so that prompted the question and some of the other questions as well.
Yeah.
And I think what we would like to know is if you decide, depending on circumstances, that you have to go down the route of making changes and relaxing the services, then I think Scrutiny would need to know about that, and because I think it would be, if you had to make some quite desperate changes, then that would impact severely on some of our most vulnerable residents. So I think that's the reason why we kind of asked the question. What you've said gives us some comfort that you haven't had to do that at this moment.
Dave?
Yeah.
Dave, could I ask a question? I'm sorry, I'm not on the system for the council. I've had to use my phone.
That's okay. If we can hear you, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Those easements are in place for approximately 2 years, is that correct? And the other question that I want to ask, it's nice to hear that there is business as usual, but will there be a backlog of assessments will you have a backlog of assessments? Because I believe that some councils haven't been able to do all the assessments for social services. Thank
Diane's
you.
got her hand up. Diane Eaton.
Yeah, shall I take this one? There's just a couple of bits. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a bit crackly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we can hear you. Yeah,
Rain, I think.
a bit crackling at first.
Just on Judith's point, it is up to 2 years, the easements legislation changes, but there are 6-month break clauses in that where the easements may be withdrawn again by the government. We have not currently got backlogs. In fact, we are able to see or facilitate support to more people using digital solutions in the main. We are doing face-to-face visits where there are any concerns or any safeguarding or any urgent crisis as well. So we're managing it okay at the moment. My only concern area will be staffing in care homes should the test, track and trace result in isolation. So we are working really closely with the providers to make sure that we're ready for that. And just to add on to Joe's comments about the hospital work, there was also new guidance for the hospital also issued at the same time as the easements, which enabled us to enable people to move out of hospital to those discharged to assess beds without the choice of a particular home. So the choice part is now carried out once the person is out of hospital. So we are still facilitating choice, but it's just not in a hospital bed. And again, that guidance is for up to 2 years and maybe withdrawn at 6 months. And all the placements are currently funded through the NHS. They are leaving hospitals, so nobody is being charged. And that is for the period of the corona event, if you like, until we are issued new guidance.
Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah. Can we move on to the other question. I'm going to have to move a bit quicker, and sorry about that, but you know, we do have a lot to get through. So the CQC report regarding learning difficulties and autistic spectrum disorder.
Okay, so you specifically asked a question about Trafford figures around this. So one of the things that, again, just to identify that, of course, in general, people who are living with learning disability do generally fall into a high risk group of individuals that may be at a higher risk, and underlying health conditions as well. So that is already recognised and known. So what have we done? We've done lots of work around shielding those people that will potentially be at higher risk. And we've made sure that some of the supported living accommodation, one of the things that has happened has been that there's been restrictions placed on people who can visit some of those settings, which it's a double-edged sword really, because if you place restrictions, then that obviously means that sometimes people don't have access to family and friends that they would ordinarily see. But also, if you do that, it minimises the risk of the amount of people that are coming in and out. And like with a lot of our settings, really, one of the things I would like Scrutiny to recognise is the work that staff have done around our care settings. In some of our care homes, staff have actually moved into those settings to minimise the risk to some of those residents. So I think some of those things have been put in place to make sure that we minimise risk. The day services that we would ordinarily provide for people have had to close as a result of making sure that there's isolation and infection control. And again, that is a double-edged sword, because I think it's important to recognise the incredible pressure that has been placed on parent carers, because that means that we don't have the respite facilities available that we used to have. That we do actually have a respite facility in Trafford if there's an emergency and an urgent need. We do have capacity to provide respite for families who are supporting somebody with learning disability and autism. So, but it goes to Diane's wider point as well, really. Some of the risks that come into play is around our staffing. So if we do have staff that test positive, or they've been in contact with somebody that then needs to self-isolate, it puts a further pressure on those services that we provide for learning disability. Diane, I'll leave you to pick up the question on kind of numbers specific for Trafford. Just to say as well, staff and people in those settings have had exactly the same access to things like PPE, infection control training, the same level of support that our care homes have had. All of that has been provided across our learning disability support services too. But I'll hand over to Diane to pick up some of the areas that I haven't quite answered.
Okay. So obviously this is a very, very sensitive issue. We have had 5 deaths reported to us in learning disabilities over March and April. That's not necessarily higher than normal. What we do is a review of everybody with a learning disability should they pass away. And we work with the coroner on that, and that's a sort of national process called LEDA. And those, we've done a quick scan of those. There doesn't appear to be anything in there of a particular concern at this stage, but they will go through the full review process. And we do work with our providers on a weekly, daily basis around any issues that support them to reduce risk. So we provide personal protective equipment through a mutual aid hub. We have worked with the providers to reduce the number of staff going in and out, and we have got a staffing resource set up should any of them then lose any of their staff around the tracking, testing, etc. Obviously, advice through public health and through to the providers has been key, but also financial support to them as they manage this. But it's a very, very difficult situation for them. None of us have obviously experienced anything like this before, and they have been absolutely amazing providers.
Yeah. Are there any questions for Diane or Councillor Harding in relation to that? Yeah, I mean, I think just to say it is very sensitive, and I think you know, the CQC has raised it, and I think it probably sent alarm bells ringing, but what you've told us, I think there is some reassurance. So thank you for that. I've got a question from Councillor Holden, but it's about testing. So I don't know what it was, John. Do you want to leave that till later when we can?
It's a very short and very simple one, I think.
Right, go on then.
It's going back to this discharge to assess.
Ah, right.
Comfortable that we're getting enough testing in there after some of the national criticisms for discharge from hospital into the care system of people who were in fact infected.
Right.
Shall I take that, Joe? We have an agreement set up from mid-March with everybody who is discharged from Manchester Foundation Trust that they would be tested before discharge into the discharge to assess beds. No test is guaranteed. Eleanor always reminds me, you know, you can catch it a minute after you've been tested, but that was a really supportive mechanism to the homes to give them confidence. However, it doesn't undermine the need to isolate people on arrival into the home, to use PPE appropriately, etc., which the homes have been doing. But I can assure you we have been testing. We now also have agreement to test people who are living at home and then choosing to go into residential or nursing homes. And that applies it for people with learning disabilities or mental health as well. Because obviously people are nervous about taking those decisions at the moment, and the testing helps both them and the home as well around accepting people.
Okay, I think the only other thing that we wanted to sort of raise with you was about the mental health.
Okay. So in relation to adult mental health services, they are operating as usual, and they have what we call a daily SITREP situation report, which is where we are daily reviewing referrals and people that we have as inpatients, particularly if we're looking to discharge somebody into the community, what that package of care looks like to make sure that's strengthened as much as possible. The big area of concern that we've had throughout all of this is to be able to manage those face-to-face contacts with people when we are supposed to be trying to self-isolate, minimise risk and so on. But again, that's staff having access to PPE equipment, infection control training, all of those things are in place for our mental health practitioners and staff. So there's helplines across Greater Manchester for people that are already known to services too. And there have been new helplines set up for people that aren't known to services and that aren't engaged in services. So there's a crisis number called Shout, which is available for people that feel they're in immediate crisis. Of course, there's the Samaritans that's available 24/7. We will obviously have to pick up and do some detailed work post-COVID, because I'm absolutely certain we are going to see evidence of trauma, grief, bereavement after this. Some of the work that I've been doing with care home providers, I was speaking to them last week, and the stories that they recounted to me were absolutely devastating, really. Some of the things that they have witnessed, the way they have stepped up has been incredible. But believe me, there will be a trauma impact when we get through this. It might not be a week down the line, it might be months down the line, but people will absolutely be adversely affected by some of the situations they have had to deal with. The Mental Health Transformation Board is being in the process of being re-established, where we look to try and shift some of the conversation away from crisis management to look at prevention, to how do we keep our communities well, how do we focus on living well at home, so we can really start to build those healthy communities. The hubs have been mentioned. That's a model that we want to build on. That voluntary and community sector offer that we have around the communities has been a good thing, and we need to absolutely build on that. So there's lots of work being done, and you know me, I'm very candid and honest about these things, and there will be gaps and there will be things that haven't been done because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and mental health was already a service that was struggling before we had COVID. So there will absolutely need to be further scrutiny done on this as we come out of it. But I, for one, will be keen for us to do that piece of work. Just by way of me having to use the out-of-hour services on behalf of a resident 3 weeks ago, I was really delighted with the response. It was a Saturday morning and I'd had a resident who was in distress, and I rang the duty worker and the issue was resolved within half an hour. So I know that staff are out there working 24/7 with a duty number. So just again, I can give reassurances, but I can also give an acceptance that there are areas around mental health that will need due attention post-COVID.
Thanks for that, Councillor Harding. I think that's very helpful. Right, well, I think that sort of deals with those issues. Yeah.
If possible, if I could just pick up on what Councillor Harding said in respect of mental health. I think, you know, from my perspective, it would be really quite welcome if we could hear about work that might be possible to be at least started before we think about the impact of a sort of post-COVID assessment, if that makes sense. I think my concern was that, you know, the most typical route into accessing mental health services is to present at your GP and to have a mental health assessment done. But obviously, at the moment, we'd be expecting that there's far fewer presentations at GP practices. And then on top of that, we also had some anecdotal evidence some months ago. I think some members may have seen that The Guardian did a report suggesting that Partington in Bucklow St Martin's ward had something like the 4th highest number of presentations per head of population at GP practices, with residents saying that they had symptoms of depression. So I really welcome the Mental Health Transformation Board work is being undertaken, but if it would be possible for the next or a subsequent scrutiny committee meeting for an update to be provided about the progress that's been made towards the mental health work, I'd really welcome that if it's possible. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely, Councillor Williams, and I concur with what you're saying, really. But just to, again, the transformation work is starting now, and you know, so yes, it's a work in progress, but I have no issue at all giving you regular updates and feedback, and welcome the input of all councillors, really, because as I've often said, it's incumbent upon all of us really to work to reduce stigma, to encourage more people to come forward, and to not wait until somebody hits crisis. So absolutely, I will come back and make sure that we give feedback, myself and Councillor Slater.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jo. Diane Eaton. Diane? Got your hand up.
She just sent me a message saying that she's been kicked out of the meeting, so I think that might be a false raise of a hand.
Oh, right. Okay. Councillor Slater.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. With Councillor Williams, we've already started some work with GMMH, so I think we can share that with the scrutiny committee in writing. We've already started to look at sort of like creative ways and technology of how we engage with the community in the post-COVID world, because obviously, like you're saying, normally the first point of contact would be with your GP, and obviously we don't want people doing that, so they are looking at telephone, social distancing, and Skype sort of systems to be able to speak with the community when they want to access stuff. So we can share that there's some information has been shared with us in writing, so we can share that with the committee. So I think that'll be quite helpful for everybody.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. Right, okay, can we now move on to the questions for the education and schools? And I think we have in attendance for the school parts Councillor Hines, who is Executive Member for Children's Services, and Jill McGregor, who's the Corporate Director of Children's Services. For education in attendance, we have Councillor Carter, who's the lead member for education, and Jill McGregor, who is the Corporate Director of Children's Services. And I think we have Karen Samples as well, because I've seen her. Yeah, there she is. Right, so I don't know which questions you want to kick off on, and who's going to kick off? Councillor Hines.
Yes, I'll start. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us tonight. I think first of all, I'd really just like to acknowledge, I think as others have, what an incredibly challenging and difficult time this has been. And I think it's been an incredibly challenging time and continues to be for all our teams really working across the council. And particularly in my role as exec member for children's services, I'd like to put on record, if I can, my thanks to everybody really who's working with children, with families, and my thanks to our foster carers, and our thanks to schools. Really, I think people have been working around the clock to try and put in place the right support. They've made really important judgments in an ever-changing landscape, and I think they've had to assess risk in a way that we've never had to do before. Really, that's been at pace, and I think it's important really to acknowledge that in making those decisions, the safety and well-being and welfare of Trafford children has really been at the heart of that decision-making process. I just wanted to acknowledge as well that we only got these questions, and some of them are really technical, on Friday. So there has been an effort really over the weekend to try to pull together the responses. And I would just like to thank Jill McGregor and Karen Samples, because I know they've worked really over the weekend, and Karina as well, in pulling together our responses. I'm hopeful that we are able to respond to those questions. As I say, some of them are very technical, and if there's anything that then follow-up wise we're not able to cover this evening, then we will follow that up in more detail in writing, if that's okay. So just moving on to the question, the first question really that was posed to us, which was that it would be useful to receive a short report on the reintroduction of Trafford children back into schools. I will hand over in a minute to Councillor Carter, but just to kind of set the scene again, I just wanted to acknowledge again really that this has been incredibly challenging for parents, for children and for schools. I think lots of people understandably have got quite a lot of anxiety, I think, around the easing of the restrictions. So we've been really trying to work very closely in supporting schools in making decisions. The schools actually are the decision makers really in terms of how they can manage the kind of the wider reopening of schools. Obviously schools have been open throughout and have been working actually through holidays, bank holidays, to support the children of key workers and vulnerable children. In terms of the wider reopening of schools, we've been supporting those schools to kind of make decisions, and I think that it has been a difficult decision-making process, but one which there's been a tremendous effort around. Just kind of as a bit of a reminder, and I think probably this is well documented, but back in May, the Prime Minister made some announcements that the schools would reopen for nursery reception year 1 and year 6 pupils with some face-to-face contact for years 10 and 12 students. In Trafford, we made a recommendation initially that schools prepare to reopen more widely on the 10th of June. But then there were some announcements on the 5th of June about the R rate in the northwest. So we made a further recommendation for schools to consider whether they needed to some additional time really to review their risk assessments in light of those announcements, and if so, whether they wanted to consider that wider reopening from today. So I'll just hand over now to Councillor Carter, who will just provide you with a bit of an update regarding the situation in terms of the wider reopening of schools. And then Karina will also take you through the questions that have been posed on the childcare and on the government's relaxation of key legislation in relation to EHCPs. And then she'll hand back to me to respond to the children in care question. And then we'll cover the rest. So if I can hand over to you, Karina.
Thank you. No pressure, Kath. So obviously, as you know, today is the day that we have all schools, and we do know that all schools are opening today to accept wider numbers of children. By the end of last Friday, even though we said to schools it would be okay to wait till today, 71 schools did open, primary schools did open last week to take in more children. And as of Friday, we had 2,006 children in schools. We gave ourselves a bit longer, and we gave schools a bit longer, because we said as an authority we would check every school's risk assessment. And that's because the health and safety legality lies with the authority. So there was a team of people working on that last week to make sure that all the risk assessments were checked. And we also needed to have a meeting with the unions, which happened last Tuesday. So all along we've said to schools, do what you're comfortable with. So whilst we'd said we were completely relaxed and would advise schools to open today, as I say, 71 did open last week. I don't know if Karen's got data from today, how many children that we've had in, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, it's too early to say at the moment, Karina. There's always a day's lag, so we'll have that data tomorrow. But, you know, we will definitely see a huge spike in terms of the numbers, just because we know that the remaining schools would be open, and equally the secondaries would begin to open to their year 10 and year 12 cohorts. So we will absolutely see a significant shift today.
It would be helpful if you could give us the figures for the first day. Yeah,
absolutely. No, that's absolutely fine. We can do that.
Thank you.
I think, Dave, Councillor Acton, we are expecting to see some sort of variations throughout the borough as well, as to, you know, just to pick up on what Catherine said about parental confidence being quite low. We certainly know there's more demand in what we see as the south of the borough than the north of the borough. So, but the figures will be able to show that when we get them.
Yeah, I think knowing what, you know, for the first day kind of thing, that all schools will be open in Trafford, it'd be useful to have that data of children. Then we can compare as we go through, really.
Yeah, we can.
Sorry, Queen, I was going to say, I think it's worth as well, Councillor Acton, recognising that every day will possibly be different as well. Because clearly, obviously, every school, they may have a rotated system. They may have a day where they close for a clean and where staff will have their planning, preparation and assessment time, their PPA entitlement. So I think we will kind of see a fluctuation over time, dependent on how schools roll out the wider reopening as they move through the days and the weeks. But I'll certainly, you know, we will certainly begin to get a better grip, I think, on the position of the number of pupils from now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's the reopening of the schools. Are you taking the next one, Karina?
Yeah, I'll take it about the childminders and obviously our early years provision and PVI settings.
Oh no, I've got a question, but I think it's.
Oh, go on.
No, was it John Lamb? Or was that with the last one?
No, David, it was just following on from the last bit of discussion about the numbers of children attending schools.
Ah, right.
And I think a good point was made. I think we're going to get some data. And I think, I can't remember who was making a really good point about the north and south of the borough, which I think really plays into the issues of children who don't have the same advantages of some of the children, and similarly the issue of children with access to digital technology, which enables them to continue their schooling when not at school. So the more data we can have, which gives us insight to that, as I'm sure you'll be very interested also, everyone will be interested, is going to be very welcome.
I think it would be interesting, John, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Informative.
I think, John, you'll be aware as well, some of the schools are just not really equipped to take very many more children. Some of the schools in older buildings or schools that already have a lot of key worker or vulnerable children just aren't going to be able to expand as much as they'd like to.
If I could just completely endorse that, Karina, I visited both Broad Oak and Ashton-on-Mersey high schools last Friday prior to those schools receiving their students today, and it really is surprising when you put a 2-metre distance between desks. You have to see it to believe it. I know it's we can say these things, but when you see it in a classroom, you realise just how restricted that is. Absolutely right.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting that the DFE have released some additional guidance literally this afternoon, where they're advocating the wider return for additional year groups on top of those key year groups we've talked about today for primary school, if schools are in a position and they've got the capacity, the space and the staffing to accommodate those additional year groups. So we'll wait and see how that impacts. I think particularly on our junior schools, I think that's potentially where we may see an increase in those children outside of year 6. But what we are making it clear to the schools is that they must absolutely not compromise their ability to provide a placement for children of key workers and vulnerable pupils. This has to be on top of.
And if I could just come in, sorry, apologies, Councillor Acton, I can't find the raise your hand button on Zoom.
No, it's fine.
Just to reiterate that as well as the provision in terms of being able to provide for children of key workers, vulnerable children, that is data that we've been required to report on to DFE, and we have been tracking and tracing those numbers and having a proactive reach out approach, both from a children's social care and a school's point of view, for the very reasons that you're articulating about what does that mean in terms of further disadvantage and lost learning. But the overall approach that we have taken has been very much that we need to understand each individual school's circumstances, how many pupils they have, the makeup of those pupils, as well as their physical building and context and location, which is why we've said our approach has been very much on a risk assessment based model, because it's really important that we take account of all of those different factors in order to be able to put the right support in place.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah. Okay, Karina, are you going to go on to the childminders now?
Yeah, crack on with the childminders. Right. So the guidance that came out, and to just reiterate what Karen said, this afternoon it was the 30th piece of guidance that's been issued by the DFE since this crisis started. So trying to keep on top of everything's been really difficult. But when the guidance came out around childminders and schools, obviously we know children have to stay in the bubbles. And so the guidance did say that the children should only attend one setting where possible. And so that children should be looked after in their bubbles. And obviously, I think probably an unintended consequence of this is it's meant that it's made life really difficult for childminders who would quite often pick up from numerous schools, and certainly would not just keep children in the bubbles. So as of last week, we did have 99 childminders were open out of, we've got 239 childminders in Trafford. 99 of those childminders were open last week, but 30 of them that were open had no children. And yet again, this reflects the fact that parents don't feel confident enough to send their children back yet. So I think one of the things I'd really like to ask the committee is about whether you can make a recommendation from this meeting to allow the LA to work with the sector to try and reopen more out of school settings and more childminders, because you know, we'd like to do that and we know they want to do it as well. I think a lot of us have had correspondence from out of school clubs that, you know, there's a real worry that a lot of this provision won't be here by the time we all get back up and running again.
Right. Are there any questions? Yeah, Councillor New.
Yeah, the actual issues that I've been contacted about with regards to this is that it's the schools that are preventing childminders from collecting. So it's putting parents under an unbelievable amount of pressure, because, you know, many are working shifts, and some of these children have been in those settings before they actually went to school. So it's like, for instance, in the situation that I've been contacted by, the child's 8 years old, and is now, this childminder has looked after this child throughout lockdown. The child's gone to school, and now she's unable to actually collect the child, which, you know, it's just creating so many issues for people. So I'm wondering if there's anything that I can go back to her with, you know, sort of from this, just to sort of reassure that, you know, things are going to be changing.
Karen.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor New. I think certainly when we've had our meetings with heads, you know, they have raised this issue of trying to manage the risk that sits with, as Karina has said, around the bubbles, managing the risk that sits outside of school and as the children actually come into school, and the potential for any cross-infection, etc., etc. We do have our early years strategic board actually tomorrow, and we've also got a meeting with primary cluster leads on Wednesday. So this is something that we can discuss at both of those forums, I think, Councillor New, because it affects both really. I think it'd be helpful to understand as well which schools we're talking about, because I'm aware of one where there's been an issue, but I'm not aware of where else it's happening. I think that would be helpful, because we can do a little bit of work and dialogue with the heads to try and find a solution really of how we can support the families and the childminders as well. But it is, I think it is unfortunately where you've got schools who are having to manage a risk, they're completing risk assessments, they're obviously getting an awful lot of guidance from DFE, which is talking about the single setting, obviously some of the information that's been presented by public health as well. But I think certainly this is part of the dialogue, this is the start of the dialogue, so we will continue to work with the sector to see how we can look at what the possible solutions are.
And just to reiterate, in terms of trying to seek solutions, Karen and I were in a meeting on Friday with the Regional Schools Commissioner, amongst others, and we're very much making representations about the confusion, not the confusion, but actually the guidance isn't always the most helpful for the sorts of circumstances that you're talking about, and not least recognising that we have a real sustainability issue in terms of the sector. So I think Karen's suggestions about, there's a couple of forums where we can look at what some of our local approaches might be while still working within the framework of the guidance, is probably really, really helpful, because we absolutely recognise the need to have a flexible wraparound childcare offer, and conversely or perversely, if you like, COVID means that it's even more important that we have some flexibility, but trying to manage that from an infection control point of view and saying it must look like this takes away some of that flexibility. So I think it's really important that we have ongoing dialogue that looks at what some of our local solutions might be, whilst recognising the need for sustainability.
Just from a public health point of view as well, one of the things going forward is really to make sure that people are honest about the arrangements that they have, and actually by having stability, a stable arrangement is much safer. Even I mean, the childminder might need to acknowledge that they might need to self-isolate if there was an infection, but actually having that knowledge of what's happening and being able to have a stable relationship is much, much better for the children, and it's better for actually the infection control, because then at least we know what's going on. If we try and be too prescriptive, things go underground and you just don't find out what's happening, and that's very risky. So it is about how we manage that support.
Okay, Are there any other questions on this topic? I mean, I think if there's anything that we as a committee can do or recommend, you know, we'll be looking.
I think just to support the flexible approach we're trying to take, really.
Yeah.
You know, and schools too will amend their risk assessments, but you know, we really don't want to see this sector go under, Dave. And I think as an authority, we need to give them as much support as we can. I think the other thing I've been asked to flag up around this is that we will see an increase in the number of children who will be eligible for the 2-year-old funding. As the disadvantage gap grows in the general population, more children will now become eligible for that free funding of places at 2. So just to make the committee aware of that.
Okay, thanks for that. Right, shall we move on to the next question, which is the relaxation of the key legislation and reasonable endeavours. So
yeah. Right, I'll make a start, but I will expect Karen and Jill to bob in as well. I think what I want to first of all say is EHCP completion times are currently at 73%, which is an increase from 61% to the last time this data was collected. And all decisions on...
When was that data collected?
That was actually part of our Send 2 data. So that was kind of when we formally provided that data for publishing.
Before the pandemic?
Yes, that would have been prior to the pandemic in terms of the Send 2 data, but we do monitor it on a monthly basis, Councillor Acton.
So all decisions for new requests are being made in the 6-week time scale, and no exceptions have been applied so far in completing the plans. So actually, I think that probably puts us in one of the top of GMCA now. We were way at the bottom a couple of years ago, but you know, that team's done a really brilliant job. So for SEND, on the whole, it's business as usual. All the panels are operating with the same frequency, regularity and representation across education, health and social care. All assessments are being completed by the Ed Psychs, and the other professionals are working online or via the telephone, depending on what the family want. And our peripatetic services are, whilst they're not working in schools, they're working as they can within line with risk assessments. So, so for the actual, the EHCP work, I think that's just, everything's just carrying on. There's been no lapse in that. Is that okay?
Yeah, so can I just check then that there hasn't been any relaxation of the legislation, basically?
So
no, we're not about it yet.
If I can come in, very similar to the Adult Easements Act, under COVID legislation, there have been amendments to the Children Act and the Adoption Act 2004. One of the things that we've done in a similar way to our adult colleagues is absolutely outline what those different freedom and flexibilities can be, the circumstances in which we might have to enact those freedom and flexibilities, not just in relation to the SEND agenda, but in terms of adoption, fostering requirements, which children we can place. We put all of that into an assurance document that's included where it will be signed off through the agency decision maker, through myself as corporate DCS or indeed members. And very much we have operated following and maintaining business as usual processes. So I know one of the questions later on that we will come to is about visits to children and some of the freedom and flexibility about visiting less often. We have not enacted that. And similarly in the SEND agenda, we have run panels in the same way, and Karen will give you the detail of that.
Yeah, just to say, Councillor Acton, just to make it clear, yeah, the panels and the decision-making process hasn't changed at all. Obviously, in terms of the actual reasonable endeavours and some of the being able to meet the needs that are, or that meet the requirements that are identified in the plans, that's where at the moment we're scoping out any of those decisions that schools have had to make. If there are challenges around meeting the children's needs, perhaps that they can't achieve because of some of the issues, you know, that the pandemic has presented for schools, we're actually collating that information. Today, I think, is the deadline for that, so that we can be really clear. What we've communicated to SENCOs and to schools is everything around the reasonable endeavours, what the legislation actually means, what it means for the children and the pupils that are in their schools and in their care. That's being fed back to us, and then to kind of close the loop, if you like, we're then going to be contacting every SENCO in all of the settings to actually have a conversation around any use of reasonable endeavours, how they are continuing to meet the needs of the children. Are there any problems? Have you worked in co-production with families and parents? Have you had that conversation and dialogue, just to make sure that we are satisfied that schools are doing everything within their power to continue to make effective provision for those children with additional needs.
Thanks for that. Are there any questions? Yeah, can I just say then, I think it's really reassuring that you know, you've not had to relax, you know, the legislation, because these are very vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And I think if there is a need to do that, I think you know, members really need to know that. So you know, very similar to, you know, the social care. Yeah, I think that's really good news that that's the case. So thanks very much for that.
Dave, so quite a lot of the supports had to go online, as you would imagine. So the sensory impairment service and the speech therapy have been sending packs home for parents, and the teacher of the deaf checks in with the schools on a weekly basis. And there is some provision, like we have some children who are doing Lego therapy. Well, evidently they can't do that at the moment. But, you know, that same level of support is being delivered, just not in the traditional way.
Yeah.
We've actually asked as well for some detail around the therapies that are being offered for children with additional needs, just so that we've got a really clear steer on their planning for recovery. And what the therapies will look like as we move forward, just so that we can see how they're being brought back into line as more and more children come back into schools.
Yeah, right. Thanks very much. So can we now move on to children in care? So thanks, Karina and Karen. No, Jill's with us on this as well. So who's going to start on this, Kath?
Yeah. So just before I do move on entirely into children in care, I just wanted to mention actually that the Children's Scrutiny Committee had presented a task and finish report to the executive some time ago, and it was just because it's related to the previous question, just to kind of mention really that we have got a response to that, and we've had that ready for some time now, but because of the changes to our operating really during the pandemic, we've not had that opportunity to present our response to that task and finish. But I did just want to say really that whilst you know, this is far from ideal and it's not what we would have wanted, actually it probably does give us an opportunity to kind of update our response really in light of what, you know, is obviously happening with COVID, and to really kind of reflect on the fact that, you know, this is a priority for us. It's going to continue to be a priority for us, and that I think, as Councillor Lamb alluded to earlier on, I think it was, you know, we've got to kind of be really mindful of, you know, that we don't want that gap to open up and become more wide. So, you know, this is something that we will make sure that we've got our focus on, and perhaps it is something that we can include in our response to the task and finish But yeah, just to kind of make that point really. So in terms of the questions around children in care, I think Jill has kind of already said really that we haven't reduced the frequency of social work visits to children in care during the pandemic. This is something that, you know, I receive regular updates on. Jill and I are in, you know, kind of constant communication really about this, and it is a priority that we remain in touch with children in care. Social workers have kind of needed probably to be flexible and to be creative in some respects in terms of how they carry out those visits. We are carrying out as many face-to-face visits as possible. Some of the visits have been carried out by video conferencing where it's been necessary to do that, but social workers have also kind of been creative in terms of trying to make sure that they're able to speak to the children when they're carrying out the visits, you know, to try and sometimes to kind of speak to the children alone if they can, and as well as as continuing to carry out the visits with at least the same frequency as before, if not in some cases increased frequency where that's been necessary. What we've tried to ensure happens is that quality of those visits is maintained. So there has been a kind of focus on this. We've had weekly updates through the performance reporting process. And there have also been 2 full audits that have been carried out, really, as I say, to ensure that that quality of visit has been maintained. We've also wanted to make sure that the experience of children is reflected and understood, and the voice of the child during the pandemic has, you know, has kind of been heard. So in terms of assurances and safeguarding, again, this obviously is something that is incredibly important, and something that, you know, we have been working very closely with our partners on, and the Trafford Safeguarding Partnership. So in addition to those measures that I've kind of already mentioned, we've also developed a clear system of contact and liaison with our schools, where vulnerable children who should be in school but haven't been attending, we've had sometimes a daily call with the schools and the first response team, which has included decision making really around whether or not somebody from the school, or it might be somebody from the service, kind of has an increased contact with the family. And I think this has been something actually that's been quite positive in terms of the development of our relationship with the schools. I think we've kind of had an incredibly close relationship with the schools around this, and a much more open dialogue. So we've kind of talked about what support schools have needed, and they've been speaking to us, because, you know, it's absolutely the case that quite often schools will know children better than anybody, you know, and we've been able to kind of build on that relationship, which has been very, very positive, and it's something that we hope to strengthen really as those restrictions are eased. As I say, we've been also working with other partners, with the police. I think we've got concerns, as you know, authorities up and down the country have got really around those children and families that perhaps emerging issues have started to arise, but perhaps that we haven't necessarily been aware of prior to the lockdown. And you know, it's because children haven't necessarily presented in the usual settings, you know, they haven't had always the same kind of presentation in some of the health settings at GPs, surgeries, and obviously
lots of children haven't been in school, we have been concerned, as I say, as other authorities, that perhaps there are children that we haven't known about. Likewise, we know that, that there may have been increases in domestic violence in families, and so we have been trying to work with the police to make sure that the incidents are flagged with us at the earliest opportunity. And we're also planning around, as restrictions do start to lift, you know, there may be a surge in referrals, and making sure that we've got plans in place to kind of to deal with all of that. And as I say, working with the Trafford Safeguarding Partnership, really to get messages out, to communicate where we know that people are presenting, and to communicate with people online as well through various different forums, really. So I think that covers that question as best as possible.
Yeah, can I bring in Councillor Thompson, who wants to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I was just wondering if we've got some numbers or best estimates of these new cases that might arise.
So in terms of our overall demand, we've seen that decrease at times by as much as 30%. So if you looked at that uplifting, then that would be a significant increase. Having said that, as you know, in 2019, our demand and the numbers of children that were receiving a social care service was probably too high for Trafford. So if you purely looked crossways, it doesn't look as great as you think, but we have seen some of our demand, particularly from our health partners, so community health settings. Last week, for example, we only had 2 referrals from a community health setting, such as a health visitor. We haven't seen the same level of referrals or contacts from schools, but as Councillor Hines has already said, the level of contacts that we're having with schools is taking almost something of a different route. So we've done quite a lot of work to say, don't forget to follow the normal routes, the normal pathways. Just because you're having a conversation about a child that you should think should be in school, if you've got a worry that means they need additional support from children's social care, you need to make the referral in the same way. So we've done a lot of proactive work, not only through the Strategic Safeguarding Partnership, but through the meetings that we've had in this period with schools. So it really feels that we're in a position where the data and the horizon scanning and the prediction of the demand feels really quite unreliable, because we've generally seen police referrals stay the same, but from our other partners, particularly health and schools being the second biggest referrer, have really quite reduced. So potentially upwards of 30% increase in demand, but I think it won't be as much as that because of some of the work that we've got ongoing.
Thanks for that. That's very helpful. No other questions? No. Can we now move on to the next one, really? Disadvantaged and vulnerable school children. There's been a lot of evidence and media interest since the lockdown. There's been a bigger negative impact on those children. So
yeah, and I think
what action we can take, really.
Well, I mean, it's an emerging picture, I think, at the moment, Dave, isn't it? And we won't actually be able to see the disadvantage gap till we get all children back in school. But I think most people will have read that Guardian article saying maybe the last 10 years of trying to close that gap might have disappeared over this time. So it's a really, really big issue for everybody. What I can say is our children, our 251 children who've got EHCP plans, we've got 185 with social workers, and we've got 237 vulnerable other children. And we know that those children have been prioritised in terms of accessing school places, and that they've been monitored. And another shout out here to schools for the free school meal vouchers, that schools have been absolutely excellent in ensuring that all of the children entitled to have had those vouchers First of all for the Easter holidays, then the May holidays, and now, you know, there's a national campaign to get that in for the summer holidays as well. So that's been really good. The work that's been going on has been around home learning, and giving people access to, we've also seen, haven't we, the problems being the digital disadvantage, we're calling it, where children don't have access to IT at home. And I know that's the next question, but as an authority, we've been encouraging schools to access the BBC Bite-Sized and the Oak National Academy, which is what the government have set up to do online lessons. We've seen lots of packs of materials delivered to children's homes. There's been some Zoom lessons and weekly calls to parents and children to check in. And I think schools have really put lots and lots of emphasis on the vulnerable children. The bigger issue is the children that haven't attended. And, you know, we know that that has been a real problem for many schools, really, to get those children back in. So I don't know if Karen wants to add anything.
No, I think you've covered most things, Karina. I think we're very aware of the challenge of the lost learning. We've created some additional subgroups with a range of representatives on it, including from schools and then across all services and different parts of the organisation, really, where we're focusing on teaching and learning and that recovery curriculum, we're calling it. I think we're going to do a lot of work around reading and vocabulary, because we know that the word gap is going to increase significantly, and without addressing that, that's going to impact on all parts of the curriculum. So there's an awful lot of work going on around that. Obviously, there's a lot of work across GM as well at the moment, so we're linking in with other parts of GM, certainly linking in with Andy Burnham and Lucy Powell, who I think have been really want to be cited on what we're going to do around bridging that gap as much as we can, and that might include summer offer and you know, and then further down the line with living with COVID. And also, you know, just think, we know that the Education Endowment Fund are also going to be producing materials which we're going to encourage schools to tap into. There's lots of catch-up and intervention programmes, those rapid improvement programmes which schools can adapt for their learners. But what we are saying to schools is we've just got to get the children ready to learn before they can actually learn. So there's a big focus on the mental health. We're very aware of the fact that this is almost like children will come back to school almost having experienced trauma, and we've really got to consider attachment and trauma-based challenges that children might have. And the Educational Psychology Service are going to be supporting schools in developing that, really. We've kind of got a two-pronged attack, really, where obviously we'll have the clinical and the health side of things, addressing some of those needs. But what we're also trying to do is equip schools to be able to handle some of these challenges themselves, so we don't need to get to that kind of referral route, really. So there'll be a lot of work in getting schools mental health champions and so on and so forth, but just understanding the position of children and getting them ready to learn before we kind of move them on. I think there's a big push for particularly some of the children who'll be going into year 1 in September to actually go back and do 2 terms worth of the early years framework, because they will have missed that and they'll be absolutely not ready to take on the challenge of a year 1 curriculum. So there's a lot of work across the GM early education leads in how, again, we try and mitigate some of the gaps that our very young children will have experienced as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Are there any questions on that? No? I mean, the last question is the mental health one, really, and particularly I know we're running out of time a bit now, but the Healthy Young Minds service seems to have a long waiting list and no longer accepting new referrals. I don't know whether that is correct or not.
That's certainly not the information that. Oh,
right.
Sorry, Kath. Do you want to come in? I'll let you speak.
Okay, no, I was just going to say that isn't the information that we've been given, that they're not accepting referrals, and we've also been told that they haven't got a really long waiting list now. They've actually only got 11 young people who are on their waiting list, and all of those 11 have actually got telephone assessments booked for June or July. They've managed to clear their waiting lists down from 105 it was at the end of March, but that's been over the COVID period, and I guess it isn't that they're not accepting new referrals. I think it's that they've had far fewer referrals than they normally would during this period, which has probably enabled them to clear some of their waiting lists. They've also, I think, because they are able to do some of their work via telephone consultation, they've been able to perhaps work with more people than they perhaps might otherwise have done, which has aided them in reducing that waiting list. They have still been offering some face-to-face appointments, particularly with those people who kind of present, I think, at the acute end, if they present certainly at A&E, but they have been doing some of their group work has been done via video conferencing as well. So obviously, I think as, you know, again, as restrictions start to ease, we need to be really mindful that actually, you know, that service is able to cope if there is a surge in demand, and likewise with our community mental health teams. I think Karen's already covered really, you know, that as we do emerge from the restrictions, you know, we need to make sure that we have got those plans in place to deal with you know, where there may be trauma. But I think to take Councillor Williams's point from earlier on, you know, what is happening now, because we do know that there are children and young people who are struggling now in, you know, in lockdown with issues impacting their mental health. And I know there has been a really big effort by some of the online support services, really, COOF being the main one that springs to my mind, really, to kind of support and to advertise really the support that they offer to young people. They've expanded their offer up to I think up to the age of 19 from 16, I think it was previously, and they've been trying very much to encourage people to use the online resources, really, because being really conscious of the fact that isolation has massively impacted the mental health of children and young people. So I'm trying to kind of cover off that as quickly as I can, but if there are any additional questions, you know, we would be happy to pick those up, and as we said earlier, to do that, you know, at a later date if we've run out of time tonight.
Yeah, I think the only point that I would probably make from what's been said is, you know, far fewer referrals through this pandemic doesn't mean to say that the problems have gone away, does it?
Yeah.
In fact, it's, you know, we're going to get an influx, aren't we, of young people, you know, when this is all over. And I think we've got to be prepared, and we've got to be thinking about how we're going to sort of handle all those issues.
And I think just to offer the committee some reassurance, we have a dedicated work stream, both in terms of response and recovery around emotional well-being, mental health. And whilst formal, if you like, some of your traditional services such as CAMS have seen that reduction in referrals, things like COOF, where you can do self-referrals, online referrals, telephone consultation, we've seen an increase in those sorts of services. So we're already proactively working with commissioners and with some of our third sector providers to try and make sure that there's a really comprehensive range of offers. We're currently doing an in-depth mapping exercise about what is the totality of the offer, which services for which groups, including which ages, which sorts of criteria of issue that they respond to, so that we can absolutely target responses in terms of where there are perceived or actual gaps in terms of that emerging and changing need, because we're incredibly mindful that some of our children and young people and our families that are normally quite resourceful, normally quite resilient, everybody will have been touched by this experience. So we need to both anticipate, take the learning from experience elsewhere, and harness the expertise across the whole system.
Absolutely, yeah. Right, well, I think that brings us to the close, really, of the meeting. Well, I just want a few minutes with the members of the committee. So for everybody else, can I really thank you all for coming along and answering those questions, the executive members and the officers, and Eleanor. So thank you all. And, you know,
thank you.
You're doing an excellent job in very difficult times, I have to say. So thanks very much. So
thank you, Chair.
You can all leave now.
Thank you. Bye,
everyone.
Bye.
Sorry, I don't actually know how to leave. Leave.
All else fails, just
I'm going.
Yeah. Right. I suppose it's what the, you know, how we sort of analyse, you know, the answers that we've got to the questions that we've asked, and how we actually deal with that, you know, and what comments we may want to make, and any recommendations that we'd like to make. But I think we need we haven't got time now, because we are due to finish in a few minutes. So I think we have a panel meeting, the agenda panel meeting this week. But what I would ask members, if they feel that some questions need further, you know, further information, really, and those that might have not just questions, but maybe recommendations, it would be useful to hear from you over the next few days to see what they might be. Obviously, it's been a long meeting, and 2 hours is a long time on Zoom, as it is when we're in real life. You know, I think we have had a lot of information. So what I suggest is that we digest that, and if you've got any thoughts about the meeting or recommendations that we might want to put, or, you know, even if it's just to, you know, note the responses and thank the, you know, the members, and, you know, the executive members and the officers for you know, what they've actually answered today. So yes, Denise. Yeah.
Yeah. I think our agenda setting meeting is actually on Wednesday.
It is,
so it's not giving people a lot of time, really,
no.
To digest such a large amount of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have to sort of rush a response, but I think whilst it's fresh in people's minds, if you know, if you any member feels that, you know, you want to raise some issues or, you know, recommendations that's come out of the meeting, then that would be useful. And we'll try and collate that as quickly as we possibly can. I mean, our next meeting anyway is the 1st of July, so we've got to set an agenda for that, and that's the other item on it's the last item on this agenda, really. I think we did talk about you know, the budgets, having a budget report and looking at that, and all that, you know, through the pandemic, there's a lot of different issues, financial issues that you know, have been impacted on through this pandemic. So I think that's probably the main one, and I would suggest if there's any other hanging over issues, you know, that would be the main item. But you know, I'm in your hands really in terms of that. So, has anybody got any thoughts? Has everybody would have? Yeah, okay, yeah, Councillor Coggy.
Just in terms of issues for the next meeting, there's obviously been a lot of radical changes to our active transport network, and I wondered if it was worth us discussing that at the next meeting.
Transport.
Active transport, the A56 cycle lane.
Oh, right,
We've
yeah.
had big issues about changing Barrington Road and Altrincham, and I suspect there'll be lots of others.
Yeah, that would be useful if members are happy to look at that. Yeah, it's what we do next, isn't it? Yeah. Do you feel that there's anything? Yeah. Sorry. There's Councillor Lamb and Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thanks, David. It was only just to, might sound counterintuitive, but just following on from Denise's comment, I think it might be useful to get comments in fairly quickly now, because I mean, all information we've listened to, it's easy to sort of forget a lot of it. And what I think might be helpful, and certainly one thing I'll be doing, is just maybe thinking about, you know, what were the 1, 2, at most 3 things that really struck us during all of that information, because we probably don't have time to go through all these responses in the great detail. We'd probably end up asking more questions, but I think that for most of us there'll probably be 1 or 2, maybe 3 things that have really come out. Think of Aidan's point about mental health. I think that also is something that struck me. For example, and that is, you know, preparedness for what Karen Samples was talking about, something that will hit a lot of children and actually all our population in the months and months to come. So, you know, that, for example, is something that's struck me. I think if we get our comments in on those sorts of lines, that ought to be done fairly quickly, which you know, might be useful then to officers and the executive.
Yeah, I mean, if members could do that, you know, I really welcome that, you know. So if you're happy to do that, then that'd be great. Councillor Bartlett.
Hi, thank you, David. Yeah, I don't want to take too much time, but I do think it's quite important, just as a very tiny thing of every meeting, just to keep an eye on the figures for track, trace, isolate. I don't think we should, you know, go into it in depth all the time, but just to really have a kind of a look at the figures as time goes by on those, because that is going to be really important, keeping, you know, the population safe. So if we could agree to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we should do that, and I think there was a number of other issues where we wanted this similar kind of thing, really, you know, just to be kept updated, and we can ask for that within, you know, a report that we might, you know, that comes from this meeting. Yeah, and I think there was something about childminders as well, wasn't there, that we could, you know, make a recommendation.
I think,
yeah.
Can I just say, Dave?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that the asking us to make a recommendation about childminders, and I know Karina just said flexible, but I think it's something that we would need to have more information on as such, because to make that recommendation might be going against various things. So, for example, a childminder, and I understand the problems about a childminder taking children to school and collecting them. It's just that some children will be vulnerable anyway. For example, 1 in 4 children have asthma, or 1 in 3, I think now. So it's also, how do you protect some children? Do they not go to school, or are they kept at home? It really seems that risk assessment to me is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we need to think about. I mean, what she actually said was that you know, the LAA, the local authority work with the sector itself in a much closer partnership, didn't she? So think that's what she was asking us to sort of do.
I think she was also asking about.
Pardon, go on.
It's giving them the flexibility, wasn't it?
Yeah.
If I remember rightly, and I just think yes, but I think we'd need to be very careful.
Well, I think that's
if we
why
are
she
going to.
wanted. Yeah, I think that's why she wanted to work in partnership with them to ensure that does happen. I would have thought anyway, but maybe we should ask for a bit more information.
Yeah, I'd be happier.
They're the kind of things really that, you know, if members can, you know, just jot your thoughts down, you know, it might just be one line or it might be paragraph or, you know,
okay.
As long as it's not an essay. Yeah. So, so are we happy to do that? And then, you know, we'll try and pull it together and then formulate some kind of, you know, report from what we've heard tonight. And that would be really helpful. So with that, if everybody's happy, I don't think there's anything else on the agenda. Alex, there's nothing else? Has he gone home? Or John?
No, I've not gone home. But yeah, there's nothing else on the agenda. It was just items to be covered for next time, but I take it you're focusing mainly on those that were raised in the meeting this time.
Yeah, that's great. Can I thank you all for you know, your patience and your questions and everything. I think you know, it's really helpful to have those kind of questions so that we can actually probe rather than just having presentations, you know, which we know a lot of the information. You know, with this, at least we found out a lot of detail, and I think the questioning around, you know, the relaxation of some of the, you know, the services. It's useful to know, you know, what actually happened there, so or what is happening there. So thanks very much, and I won't say have a safe journey home because you're all home. So goodbye. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.